do you believe in your own goodness? If someone ordered you to hurt a complete stranger you had no prior conflict with, would you do it? Over 99% of people confidently answer, absolutely not. We all believe we possess a moral compass strong enough to distinguish right from wrong. But today, I am going to shatter that belief with the most shocking psychological experiment in the world. It proved that, under the right conditions, an ordinary human being who loves their family, pays their taxes, and goes to church every day can transform into a sadistic guard or a killer in less than 15 minutes. Brace yourself, because this truth might make you terrified to look at your own reflection in the mirror ever again. The origin of this darkness traces back to the aftermath of World War II, when Adolf Eichmann, a high-ranking Nazi officer who orchestrated the mass murder of millions of Jews, was put on trial. The world expected to see a ferocious monster, but what they found was a mild-mannered, middle-aged man who looked like an ordinary office worker. Eichmann testified in court with a flat, emotionless voice, saying, "I didn't hate the Jews. I was just following orders. I was merely a cog in the machine." The excuse "I was just following orders" sent shockwaves through the field of psychology, raising a chilling question. Does evil stem from inherent human nature or from the power of authority? In 1961, Stanley Milgram, a psychologist at Yale University, set up a secret laboratory. He placed ads looking for everyday volunteers, deceiving them by claiming it was an experiment on memory. The volunteer would play the role of the teacher, while an actor hired by the research team played the learner. The rule was simple. If the learner answered a question incorrectly, the teacher had to press a button to administer an electric shock as punishment. The voltage started at 15 volts, a mild jolt, and escalated to a maximum of 450 volts, which was clearly marked with a red warning label reading, "Danger, severe shock." What the volunteers didn't know was that the shock generator was fake, and no one was actually being electrocuted. The screams of agony they heard were merely pre-recorded audio, but to the volunteers, everything was absolutely real. They saw the learner strapped to a chair with electrodes attached to his body. Inside the lab stood a man in a white lab coat, standing nearby, taking notes with a completely stoic expression. This man in the white coat represented the authority figure who would dictate their lives for the next few minutes. As the experiment began, the learner intentionally answered incorrectly. The teacher administered shocks at low levels. At 75 volts, grunts of pain could be heard. At 150 volts, the learner screamed, "Let me out of here! I have a heart condition." Many volunteers began to sweat profusely, their hands trembled, and they looked back at the man in the lab coat, begging to stop the experiment. But the man in the lab coat responded with a single, chillingly calm sentence: "The experiment requires that you continue." This is where the dark psychology truly kicks in. Milgram called this the agentic state. When humans are pressured by a figure of authority, our brains flip a switch, instantly transferring all personal responsibility to the person giving the orders. The volunteers started comforting themselves, thinking, "I don't want to do this, but he's forcing me. I'm not responsible because I'm just doing my job." This exact defense mechanism is what allows humans to commit horrendous atrocities without feeling guilt, because they no longer see themselves as the perpetrators, but merely as tools of someone else. At 330 volts, the learner's screams fell completely silent. No more answers, no more pounding on the wall. There was only a dead silence that could be interpreted as, he had either passed out or was already dead. Yet, the majority of the volunteers continued to deliver the shocks under the orders of the man in the lab coat. They did this while hyperventilating, crying, and biting their own lips until they bled. This stark contradiction between their actions and their internal feelings demonstrated that defying authority is actually much harder than harming a fellow human being. Before the experiment, the world's leading psychiatrists predicted that only 1% of the population, the absolute psychopaths, would be willing to administer the shock up to the maximum 450 volts. But the actual results shocked the world to the point of rewriting history. A staggering 65%, or 2/3 of the volunteers, pressed the button all the way to the maximum 450 volts, even when they believed the person on the other side might already be dead. Normal people, bus drivers, teachers, housewives, they all became executioners simply because a man in a lab coat stood there and told them to. Why didn't people just stop halfway? Another explanation is the theory of the sunk cost fallacy. Once you've shocked someone at 200 volts, stopping at 215 volts means you have to admit that the 200 volts you just delivered was a mistake and immoral. Humans hate admitting they are wrong. In order to preserve the internal image that I did nothing wrong, what I did from the start was justified, they choose to continue committing horrific acts just to legitimize the initial acts of violence. The main thing controlling this game wasn't a gun or a knife, it was the white lab coat. Milgram repeated the experiment with the authority figure wearing a plain t-shirt, and the obedience rate plummeted to almost zero. Uniforms, titles, and ranks are things humans have been programmed to surrender to since childhood. We are taught to obey doctors, obey teachers, obey the police, to the point where our brains automatically shut down our critical thinking systems the moment we see a symbol of authority. Another secret that makes harming others easier is creating distance. In this experiment, the teacher couldn't see the learner's face. They only heard his voice. Not having to look the victim in the eye makes it much easier to erase their humanity, a process called dehumanization. It's exactly like in the modern era, where people can coldly type insults, bully, or destroy someone else's life on the internet, simply because they see them as mere text on a screen, not a flesh and blood human being with feelings. Philosopher Hannah Arendt coined a term for events like this: the banality of evil. True evil doesn't always come from a maniac wielding a chainsaw. It often comes from an ordinary person in a suit stamping documents, sending people to their deaths without feeling a thing, because they claim, I'm just following company policy, or I'm just following the boss's orders. The most terrifying evil is the evil that disguises itself in seemingly perfectly normal daily routines. So, what about the 35% who dared to stand up and refuse the orders? Who were they? Psychologists found that this group didn't necessarily have more physical courage than others, but they possessed a remarkably high level of personal accountability. They refused to shift the blame to the boss. They questioned the rules, and they had the courage to say no. No matter what you order, if it's immoral, I will not do it. This is the most crucial skill the modern world needs, the skill of being a traitor to a rotten system. After the experiment ended, Milgram revealed the whole truth to the volunteers, letting them know no one died. But the psychological scars were deeply embedded. Many volunteers had to spend the rest of their lives disgusted with themselves. They had seen the monster within their own minds, a monster ready to kill just to appease an authority figure. This experiment was so scandalous that it forced the field of psychology to rewrite all of its ethical guidelines, strictly prohibiting any future experiments that inflict irreversible psychological trauma on human subjects. This isn't just history in a textbook. It happens around us every single day, from violent college hazing because the seniors ordered it, to corporate fraud because the boss said, hit the numbers, to ganging up and bullying a coworker just out of fear of being ostracized. Milgram's experiment is a giant mirror reflecting just how fragile our morality is when faced with social pressure. If you don't want to become someone else's tool, you need to practice hacking your own brain. The first rule is to pause the autopilot. Whenever someone in a uniform, with a title or with authority, orders you to do something that feels slightly off, freeze time for 5 seconds and ask yourself, if I were the one giving this order, would I still do it? Pulling yourself out of the agentic state and back into personal responsibility is the ultimate shield against brainwashing. Milgram's experiment is the nightmare that woke humanity up. It taught us that the line between a good person and a cold-blooded killer might be thinner than paper drawn solely by the word obedience. The next time you decide to do something simply because someone ordered you to do it, take a deep look in the mirror. Is the person making the decision truly you, or are you just a heartless cog in a machine? What about you? If you were sitting in that chair, at how many volts do you think you would have the courage to stop? Let me know in the comments. See you in the next video. May you truly be the master of yourself.